Nobody saw this coming. Not the family, not the attorneys, not the people who've been following this case from the very beginning. The FBI just made a move in the Nancy Guthrie investigation that has completely changed everything. And we mean everything. Think about that for a second. The FBI, not local police, not a county sheriff's department. The actual Federal Bureau of Investigation decided that this case, this specific case, needed their attention, their resources, and their authority. That doesn't happen by accident. That doesn't happen because someone filled out a form and got lucky. That happens because something significant was uncovered. Something that crossed a line that local investigations simply don't have the power to handle alone. And here's what makes this even more intense. The people who loved Nancy Guthrie have been fighting for this moment, pushing for it, demanding answers from anyone who would listen. They kept saying, loudly, persistently, even when it felt like nobody was hearing them, that the truth hadn't come out yet. They were right, because what's emerging now suggests that the full story of what happened to Nancy is bigger, more complicated, and more disturbing than anything that's been reported publicly. We're going to walk through all of it today, from the very beginning to the moment that just happened. And trust us, you need to hear every single part of this. Let's go. Before we get to the FBI and what they just did, we need to take you back to the beginning, because you can't fully understand the significance of what's happening right now without understanding who Nancy Guthrie was and what made this case refuse to stay quiet, no matter how hard some people tried to make it disappear. Nancy Guthrie was not a stranger to the people in her community. She was present, visible, the kind of person who showed up for her family, for the people around her, for the moments that mattered. People who knew her describe her in consistent terms: warm, dependable, real. She wasn't a headline waiting to happen. She was a person living her life. And then, without warning, that changed. When Nancy's story first became public, there was the usual rush of attention, coverage, concern, the kind of community response that emerges when something terrible happens to someone people know and care about. But then something uncomfortable started happening. The answers that were coming didn't feel complete. The timeline that was being presented didn't sit right with people who knew Nancy well. There were gaps. There were inconsistencies that someone should have been asking harder questions about. And for a while, those harder questions weren't being asked loudly enough. Nancy's family felt it immediately. The sense that the narrative being built around what happened didn't match the person they knew. That details were being glossed over. That the investigation, while technically active, wasn't pursuing certain directions that desperately needed to be pursued. They pushed. They advocated. They refused to let the case become another story that fades from attention. When the news cycle moves on, and they weren't alone, people in Nancy's community rallied around the questions that weren't being answered. Journalists started looking closer. Amateur investigators online started mapping out the inconsistencies and the timeline problems and sharing what they found. The noise grew. And here's the thing about noise: when it gets loud enough, when it's organized enough, when it's based on real questions rather than speculation, it eventually reaches people with the authority to act on it. That's what happened here. But the FBI's involvement didn't just come from public pressure. That's important to understand. Public pressure can draw attention. It can create urgency. But federal agencies don't open investigations based on community feeling. They open them based on evidence, based on specific, verifiable, legally significant information that justifies their jurisdiction and warrants their resources. So the real question, the question that's driving everything happening right now, is what did they find? What specific information crossed the threshold from complicated local investigation to active federal case? The answer to that question starts with understanding the full picture of what happened to Nancy. And that picture, when you see it clearly, is more disturbing than most people have been willing to acknowledge publicly. Until now. Let's start with something that often gets lost in cases like this. The person, not the case file, not the headline, not the name attached to a story that millions of people click on. The actual human being at the center of all of it. Nancy Guthrie was private in the way that genuinely strong people often are. She had warmth that was immediately apparent to anyone who spent time around her. But she kept her inner world close. Trusted carefully. Let people in slowly. That's not secrecy. There's an important difference between a person who hides things and a person who protects themselves. Nancy was the latter. People who knew her well have described a woman who was carrying more than she showed. Financial pressures that had been quietly building. Relationship dynamics that the people on the outside of her life never fully saw. Decisions that had been made, some by her, some by people around her, that were creating consequences she was navigating largely alone. None of that explains what happened to her. Nothing excuses it. But it matters for understanding the full picture. Because here's where cases like this go wrong early. Investigators build a narrative. They find the version of events that fits the available evidence, and they organize everything around it. And often that narrative focuses on the surface, on what's visible, what's easy to document, what's simple to explain. But Nancy's life wasn't simple, and the events that ultimately put her at the center of a federal investigation weren't simple either. The people who knew her recognized immediately that the early investigation was working from an incomplete picture. They saw the narrative being built, and they kept saying, "This doesn't match who she was. This doesn't account for things we know. This is leaving out context that changes everything." Getting anyone in an official capacity to take that seriously was harder than it should have been. Here's the part that really matters though. Nancy had relationships with people, with institutions, with situations that extend beyond what a local investigation would naturally map. Her life had layers that crossed lines that local jurisdictions don't easily follow. That's significant because federal jurisdiction becomes relevant precisely when a case crosses those lines. When the scope of what happened, the people involved, the methods used, the potential legal violations extend beyond what local law enforcement has the authority or resources to pursue. The FBI doesn't step in to duplicate what local agencies are already doing. They step in when the case is bigger than what's already being investigated. And this case, it turns out, is significantly bigger. There were people in Nancy's life whose connection to what happened wasn't immediately obvious, whose involvement only becomes visible when you look at communication records, financial trails, and location data across a broader timeline than the local investigation was examining. Those people are now in a very different situation than they were even weeks ago. Because someone started looking closer. Someone followed the threads that the local investigation wasn't following. And what they found changed the entire shape of this story. Who started looking? And what exactly did they find? That's where this gets intense. Every investigation has a breaking point, a moment where the official version of events and the actual truth start visibly pulling apart, where the gap between what's being said publicly and what the evidence actually shows gets wide enough that it can't be papered over anymore. In the Nancy Guthrie case, that moment came through data. Not dramatic testimony, not a whistleblower walking into a police station with a folder full of documents, data, the quiet, unglamorous, completely reliable kind of data that your phone and your financial accounts generate constantly, without you even thinking about it. The timeline that had been established early in the investigation, the one that placed specific people in specific locations at specific times, started developing problems when someone looked carefully at the digital record. Cell phone data doesn't lie. It doesn't misremember. It doesn't get nervous under questioning or adjust its story based on what's convenient. It records where a device was, when it was there, and what it was communicating. And when that data was examined carefully in this case, what emerged was a timeline that contradicted the one that had been officially accepted. Not by minutes, by enough to matter. By enough to fundamentally change who could have been where and when, and therefore, who had to be looked at differently. This discovery didn't immediately transform the investigation, and that delay, the period between when this discrepancy was identified and when it was seriously acted upon, is one of the most troubling aspects of this entire case. Because in that window, things happened that may have affected the evidentiary record. People who should have been questioned more carefully had time that they shouldn't have had. But the data existed. And data, once it's in the record, doesn't disappear. Then there were the financial patterns. Money tells stories. The way it moves, the timing, the amounts, the accounts it passes through, creates a narrative that, when you know what to look for, can reveal intent, can reveal planning, can reveal coordination between parties whose connection might not be obvious from any other angle. The financial picture in Nancy's case, when examined across a longer timeline than the local investigation was looking at, showed patterns, transactions that didn't make sense in isolation, but started making a different kind of sense when mapped against the communication records and the corrected timeline. Here's what's critical about that. Financial patterns of that nature, particularly when they suggest coordination across multiple parties, fall into federal territory. Wire fraud, conspiracy, potential civil rights implications depending on the parties involved and the nature of the coordination. These aren't abstractions. These are specific federal statutes that give the FBI both the jurisdiction and the authority to investigate in ways that local agencies simply cannot. Someone made the connection. Someone took the corrected timeline, the financial patterns, and the communication records and saw not a complicated local matter but a federal case. And then they made a call. But before that call got made, something else happened. Something that gave the evidence an entirely new dimension and made the case for federal involvement undeniable. A person came forward, and what that person said changes everything you think you know about this story. Cases break open in different ways. Sometimes it's technology, sometimes it's forensics, sometimes it's the slow accumulation of evidence that finally reaches a tipping point, and sometimes it's a person, one unexpected, hard-to-predict person who decides that the cost of staying silent has finally exceeded the cost of speaking up. In the Nancy Guthrie case, that person emerged, and their decision to come forward, made carefully, slowly, after a long period of internal struggle, is what transformed this from a troubled local investigation into an active federal matter. We're being careful here about specific identifying details for reasons that are both legal and practical. What we can tell you is that this individual had been connected to this situation from the beginning, not centrally, not in ways that made them an obvious person to talk to early on, but connected in ways that, it turns out, gave them access to information that nobody else had in quite the same form. They knew things, not from second-hand sources, not from rumors or inference, from direct experience, from being present in moments and conversations that were never supposed to become part of any public record. What they eventually shared, first with someone connected to Nancy's family and support network, and then with people who had the legal standing to act on it, fundamentally reframed the case. The information involved direct communication, specific communication between specific parties, whose relationship had never been publicly established or examined. Communication that happened at critical points in the timeline. Communication that, when read in context and cross-referenced with the financial and location data that already existed, tells a story of coordination. That word matters. Say it again, coordination, because coordination means this was not a spontaneous situation. It means decisions were made in advance. It means more than one person was involved in those decisions. It means that what happened to Nancy was, at least in significant part, planned. That conclusion, supported by the communication evidence this witness brought forward, corroborated by existing data, and now being examined by federal investigators with the tools to fully authenticate it, is what makes this case so much bigger than it initially appeared. Here's the emotional reality underneath all the legal and investigative detail. This witness was afraid, genuinely, concretely afraid in ways that went beyond social consequences or professional risk. They had reason to believe, specific, grounded reason, that coming forward put them in physical danger. They came forward anyway, quietly, without fanfare, without the kind of dramatic public disclosure that gets covered breathlessly in real time. They made contact with the right people, shared what they knew, and then waited while others decided what to do with it. That kind of courage is different from the kind that gets celebrated. It's smaller and more terrified and more real. And it may be the single most important thing that has happened in this investigation. Because without that witness, the timeline discrepancy and the financial patterns might have remained complicated, but inconclusive. With the witness's account added to the evidentiary picture, the shape of what happened snaps into focus in a way that changes everything. And what happened after that witness came forward set a chain of events in motion. That is still unfolding right now. When the FBI formally enters a case, the temperature in the room changes. Ask anyone who's experienced it from any position, as a subject, as a witness, as a family advocate watching it happen from the outside. There is a palpable shift. The bureaucratic weight of a federal investigation is different from a local one. The authority is different. The resources are different. And most critically, the legal exposure for everyone connected to the case is different. The FBI's entry into the Nancy Guthrie investigation didn't come as a public announcement. It rarely does at the stage where they're making their most significant moves. It came through action, through contact, through the kinds of formal legal processes that make clear this is not a courtesy call or a preliminary inquiry. People connected to this case received outreach that was unmistakably federal in nature, targeted, specific, the kind of outreach that comes after a significant intelligence-gathering phase has already concluded, meaning, by the time people were aware the FBI was actively in the case, investigators had already been working it quietly for longer than anyone realized. That's how these things work. The visible action is never the beginning. It's the product of a process that's been underway behind the scenes. Electronic devices became the subject of formal legal processes, federal-level processes, the kind that require judicial authorization and specific, probable cause, meaning investigators had already built enough of a case to convince a federal judge that those devices likely contained evidence of federal crimes. That bar is not low. Clearing it means something, and there are indications, credible, from sources familiar with how these investigations develop, that at least one individual who had been comfortable declining to cooperate with local investigators is now in a fundamentally different position. Here's why that matters so much. One of the most persistent frustrations in this case, for Nancy's family, for the community members who stayed engaged, for the journalists and independent investigators who kept asking questions, was the sense that people who had something to say were calculating that silence was safe. Federal involvement resets that calculation completely. The legal consequences of obstructing a federal investigation, of providing false statements to federal agents, of withholding material information from an active federal inquiry. These are categorically more serious than anything the local investigation could threaten. And people who were comfortable with their previous risk calculus are now, quietly, consulting attorneys and reconsidering their positions. That movement, that shift in what silence costs, is itself a form of progress. It's pressure applied at the right level to the right points in the system. For the people who loved Nancy and have been waiting for exactly this kind of pressure, there's real relief in knowing it's finally happening. But there's also the hard truth that federal investigations take time. The same thoroughness that makes them powerful makes them slow. Nancy's family may have to wait longer still, and living with that, holding on to hope while the process moves at its own pace, is its own kind of wait. What comes next in the investigation is still developing, but the specific details of what's already been uncovered, they're more disturbing than most people expected. Now we get to the part of this story that people are going to be talking about. When you lay out what's actually known, without the protective framing of official narratives, without the PR-managed version of events, the picture that emerges is genuinely shocking. Not sensational. Shocking in the way that truth is sometimes shocking. In the way that reality, when it finally comes into clear focus, can feel harder to process than anything fictional. The physical locations connected to key events in this case were, almost without exception, unremarkable, ordinary, forgettable in that specific way that suggests intentionality rather than coincidence. People who study how crimes are planned and executed describe this pattern, the deliberate use of ordinary settings, places that don't draw attention, that blend into the background of daily life, as a marker of forethought. This wasn't chaotic. This wasn't impulsive. The geographic pattern suggests someone who thought carefully about what would and wouldn't attract notice. Then there's the communication pattern itself, based on what's been pieced together from reporting around the edges of the investigation and from partial legal filings that have become accessible. The communication between key parties followed a specific and deliberate structure, not emotional, not reactive, Calculated, there were gaps in that communication, points where the digital trail becomes deliberately thin, that correspond precisely to moments in the timeline where critical decisions were being made or actions were being taken. People don't randomly change how they communicate. They change it when they're concerned about being